Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 1 discussion. Today, let's talk about some of the things that have been going on in PathOfExile 1's Trade League economy in Mercenaries Softcore. This has been an interesting weekend. And when I say interesting, it's been a pretty wild ride for people that have been sitting on Chaos Orbs or Divine Orbs, which is probably most of you. Let's have a look at the exchange rate, shall we? You'll see that it's currently something like 240 to 1. This was very, very different just a couple of days ago. A couple of days ago, I was regularly selling Divine Orbs for 152, 156, 162 Chaos. Now, then last night my time, something like 12 hours before I'm recording this video, I needed a bunch of Chaos Orbs, and I was able to buy 5,000 of them for just 21 Divine Orbs. There's definitely been a big shift that's gone on, and it's been sustained. So I want to talk about where that's coming from, and also what I think the future is likely to hold. But firstly, let's just start with the facts of the matter before we get into anything that's more opinion-based. As you can see, the current fair market value for a Divine Orb is something like 240 Chaos Orbs. But what happens when we look at some other commodities that get traded quite a bit and that are fairly valuable? So let's start with the Echo of Reverence, shall we? This is one of the new Pinnacle Boss Atlas. So let's start with the Echo of Reverence, shall we? This is one of the new entry tokens for one of the Pinnacle Bosses. And you'll see it's something like 2.25 Divine Orbs. This is currently going for 550-ish Chaos Orbs, and the exact amount does vary, but it's in that sort of broad ballpark amount. Syndicate Medallion, aka the Katarina Access Token. This one has actually gone up even against the Divine Orb, but it's gone up even more against the Chaos Orb. But the Echo of Reverence has stayed roughly the same against the Divine Orb. And as I tried to check a bunch of other different sorts of commodities that people trade a lot, it turned out that most of them were still trading in roughly the same ratios against the Divine Orbs that they previously did. It's just that they're now trading for more Chaos Orbs than they used to do. So my first conclusion here is, or what I had originally thought, and that is that my first conclusion in this video is going to be that it is the Chaos Orb falling in value, it is not the Divine Orb rising in value. Divine Orbs aren't purchasing more than they did a couple of days ago. In fact, in some cases they're purchasing less, like the Syndicate Medallion, like against the Mirror Shard, but it's more the case that people are just losing interest in trading into Chaos Orbs. Why is that? Here we get into a bit more speculation, but I do think there's a bit of evidence for what I'm going to say. So have a look at Morbid Mire here. This is a fortress map that I think many players would elect to roll over. It has rare monsters have volatile cores. This modifier is horrifyingly dangerous. It has a few other things on it that are fairly mean. Monsters gain 48% of extra life as maximum energy shield. This can be particularly obnoxious with a map boss like Fortress map boss that has a lot of hit points. And then it's got a few other things on it that just might interfere with your build in certain ways. I would say that a fair number of players are going to look at this and say, nah, I'm rolling over this. How do you roll over this? Well, you've only got one real choice, and that is the Chaos Orb. Okay, sure, you can apply a Delirium Orb, you can apply a Chisel, you can apply a Val Orb, and the Val Orb might change the mods on it, but the primary way you're going to change these mods is with Chaos Orbs. Contrast this to the new tier 16.5 / Zana influence / Gommage influence, whatever you want to call these maps. These maps do not require Chaos Orbs to re-roll. They also are allowed to have as few as 4 modifiers, which is not the case. They're also allowed to get into 4 modifier states as well, which makes them less likely to be nasty than the tier 17 mod. They're also allowed to be 4 modifiers, which makes them less likely to be nasty than tier 17 mods. Now, the key thing that's changed is that there's been a number of strategies published over the last weekend that abandoned tier 17s in favor of Gommage influence maps. And what this is meaning is that there's more and more players that are jumping ship from 17s into 16.5s. What are these players doing with Chaos Orbs now? Well, they're not using as many of them as they were before. Now, there's a few things that can pick up some of this extra. So essentially, top-end players are just destroying... So essentially, top-end players are deleting less Chaos Orbs than they were in the past. There are, however, a few things Chaos Orbs can be used for that are not related to rolling maps. The first one of them is, of course, Zana's mods, or the map device mods, or Kirak mods, whatever you want to call them now that the endgame has all changed. In particular, there's the heist one, which is probably the one that has the highest value, but that's kind of its own entire strategy. There's a small section of the player base that do this, but a lot of people just aren't interested in it. Otherwise, though, a lot of these don't actually do anything all that useful. Prior to patch 3.20, it was impossible to get a 100% chance to get the Delirium Mirror on the passive tree. So if you wanted to get the Delirium Mirror, you had two choices. You could either use the map device in order to force Delirium on, or you could spec into a percentage chance to get the Delirium Mirror. Now you have the option of a baseline Delirium Scarab if you want to use it. You've got the option of using the map device mod, or you've got the option of just speccing about 20 points in order to get 100% Delirium chance in every single map. What this means is that there's just a lot less utility for many of these map device mods. Now, the ones that stack, for instance, Anarchy, this just adds 7 additional rogue exiles. Whether you've got exiles there or not already, this just adds 7 more of them, and so that ends up being pretty good to use, even if you're already running a rogue exile strategy. In fact, especially if you're already running one. But there are certainly some that are like that, but for a lot of them, it is just binary, and those ones essentially aren't useful at all, except maybe for the newest of players that just want to try out a strategy before they commit to setting up an atlas around it. So, the map device is using less Chaos Orbs than it did in Path of Exile's history. The second thing is that for most item slots, Chaos Orbs are just not a very good way of rolling an equipable item. In fact, they're pretty terrible at it. The second thing is that for most item slots that your character can equip, using Chaos Orbs to roll them is pretty terrible. Now, this isn't true for jewels, and it's not true for some cluster jewels. There are some situations in which directly applying Chaos Orbs to gear is a reasonable use. However, these are pretty rare, and most of the time, people aren't using large amounts of Chaos Orbs in this way. And then there's a few things you can do with them, like you can come to Kirak. You can come to Kirak, you can go to his purchase screen and you can go, oh, do you have any chisels for me? And usually he does. But these are just not very explosive amounts of currency, and most players just aren't interested in bothering with them. So essentially, there's nothing that's really sinking an enormous amount of Chaos Orbs out of the Trade League economy. There are definitely some sinks, but they have decreased because the most significant one of them was Tier 17 maps. So what's the evidence to back this up? Well, it's the collapse in price of Tier 17 maps. Fortress maps... So what's the evidence for this claim? It's a collapse in price of Tier 17 maps that took place at about the same time as the surge in the value of the Divine Orb against Chaos Orb, which is over the last weekend. There are now more people looting Tier 17s and not looking to run them themselves than there were before. There are fewer people running Tier 17s and not looting any than there were before. Combination of these factors is that there's just simply more Tier 17s in the economy. They're kind of flooding the economy a bit, and as a consequence of these things is that there's just more of a build-up of Tier 17s available in trade, and when there's more supply and less demand, you end up in a situation where prices tend to go down. So essentially, that's why we're seeing all these changes with the Divine Orb, and so that's what we're seeing. So that's the reasons for the changes with the Divine Orb and the Chaos Orb. will this continue from here? I don't think we're going to see a repeat of what we've seen in Path of Exile 2 with the Exalted Orb, where the Exalted Orb has just ceased to be a relevant currency. A lot of people don't pick them up at all anymore. I think instead we're going to see that the Chaos Orb is going to continue to be picked up by most players because there are still some of these scalable sinks. You can still go, all right, I'm going to add a map mod on with that. You can just simply start using more Chaos Orbs if you have more. But I wouldn't be surprised if we do see a little bit further on this trend of, from 240, maybe it'll go a little bit further before some of those additional use cases start really kicking in and we start seeing more people before we start seeing more of an uptick in use of some of those Chaos Sinks that do exist in game. Most notably, that comes down to the fact that applying Chaos Orbs to items is just not a very good Chaos Sink. It deletes the Chaos Orb, it just doesn't produce very many usable items compared to all the other crafting tools that we've got in this game. Another factor, though, that I think often doesn't get talked about enough is that the Path of Exile 1 player base is much, much, much more experienced than the Path of Exile 1 player base of a few years ago. Another thing I don't think gets talked about enough, though, is the Path of Exile 1 player base, the average level of experience seems to be much higher than it was in the past. And what this means is that anyways, I'm going to leave it there. May your Chaos Orbs and Divine Orbs have interesting results. One other factor that needs to be mentioned here is that Sanctum received a number of nerfs in this league, both direct nerfs in the terms of a reduction in the number of direct Divine Orb drops that it provides, and also indirect nerfs such as the introduction of the divination card Damnation, which makes one of the most valuable of the Sanctum jackpot rewards available through sources that are not the Sanctum mechanic. This has led to less players specializing in the Sanctum, and as a result, it is generating fewer Divine Orbs. It's kind of hard to quantify how big an effect this is, though, because it's always the case that when some changes like this happen, you do tend to see an increase in the value of some of the other things that only come out of Sanctum. Things like the unique item Sandstorm Visage, and sometimes those can end up compensating for what's happened. I don't think it has. I think Sanctum's in a worse place than it was a month ago, but it is. I don't think that has happened. I think Sanctum's I don't think that's happened. I think Sanctum is actually genuinely worse than it was, but I do think that all in all, Sanctum is not affecting Divine Orb prices as much as it has in the past, but it's really unclear to say exactly how long. All in all, I don't think Sanctum's affecting Divine Orb prices as much as it has in the past, and that's another slight factor that is exacerbating the main issue that we've been talking about. But I think the primary thing is the change in popularity from tier 17 maps to tier 16.5s. If that continues to be the case, if like me, you prefer tier 17s to 16.5s, then this is going to be fantastic news for us. If you're like many other players who prefer 16.5s to 17s, then this is going to be a bit annoying for you. Eventually, maybe there'll be a price point where if you're one of the players like myself that prefers tier 17s to 16.5s so far, then you might find that this is a one thing I'll conclude with, it'll certainly be interesting to watch how this develops over the rest of the league. One thing I think will definitely be interesting will be to watch how this develops over the rest of the league. Kind of curious to Kind of curious to see whether you think that the exchange rate of Chaos... One thing that I think will be interesting will be watching to see how this develops over the rest of the league. Will it be the case that Chaos Orbs continue to fall, or will a new floor be found under them? And if so, what's going to underpin that? We'll have to see on that. I'm going to leave it there. May your Divine Orbs and your Chaos Orbs have interesting results.